In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the political system of Imperial Germany under the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, Wilhelm II's reign dates from 1888 to 1918, and it marks a significant shift in the political landscape of the German Empire. This lesson specifically is going to focus on all of those same questions and all of those same problems that we did in the previous video, but instead of looking at Kaiser Wilhelm I, we're going to look at Kaiser Wilhelm II. We will look at government and opposition, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellors, his personalities and his policies, the place of the Reichstag in the German Empire during this period, as well as the struggle between autocracy and democracy, and then finally think about the development of political parties and opposition. So Kaiser Wilhelm II, the more famous of the two, partially due to the fact that, of course, we have to think about during this period the First World War and the impact of the First World War and the collapse of the imperial system under his leadership. Now, Wilhelm II's personality was described as impulsive, ambitious, and often very unpredictable. It was seen that he sought to wield more direct control over German politics and German policy than his predecessor, Kaiser Wilhelm I, who, as you remember from the previous lesson, took a more hands-off approach to government and to leadership and left most of the work of day-to-day policy in the hands of his Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Wilhelm II was determined, however, to assert his own authority, aspiring to create a German project and to establish Germany as a world power. He was passionate about military expansion, he was passionate about imperialism, and he was passionate about increasing Germany's influence on a global level. And so, in terms of policies and and his style of government, you can see that this essentially leads itself to establishing a more hands-on approach to government and to governance, frequently intervening in both domestic and foreign policy matters. One such example of this is his emphasis on something known as Weltpolitik, sometimes translated to world policy. Weltpolitik was this idea of expanding Germany's influence through colonialism, through a powerful navy, one that would be able to challenge that of the British, and to create an assertive diplomatic stance in terms of his policy. This would diverge from Bismarck's focus on maintaining a very, very delicate balance of power in Europe and to try and avoid conflicts where necessary. The contrast is that Wilhelm II had a very aggressive style in foreign policy, the emphasis on military expansion, which would often antagonize other European powers and would then set the stage for an increasing of international tensions, which ultimately leads us to the First World War. Wilhelm's desire for control led to a number of chancellors, whereas under the predecessor to Wilhelm II, Wilhelm I, you only had Otto von Bismarck, who is quite blurrily pictured here on screen. Wilhelm II had a number of chancellors who were often chosen on the basis of their willingness to follow rather than to lead the political abilities and ambitions of his of the empire, essentially. Some notable chancellors and their approaches included, firstly, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck only survived under Wilhelm II for 2 years. Wilhelm II took emperorship in 1888. Bismarck lasted until 1890. Bismarck's initial chancellorship continued as it did under Wilhelm II, but the two clashed almost immediately. Wilhelm disliked Bismarck's authoritarian style and his focus on maintaining stability in Europe. The differing views led to the resignation that was forced by 1890, particularly differing views on domestic policy, including the anti-socialist laws that were established by Bismarck himself. And then this brings us to more compliant chancellors. You have Leo von Caprivi, who was chancellor between 1890 and 1894. A bit more compliant and moderate, supporting social reforms and abandoning the anti-socialist laws that were imposed by Bismarck. Von Caprivi attempted to liberalise trade policies and to improve relations with Britain, but his attempts to reduce the authoritarian measures led to dissatisfaction among a number of the people who were very much in favour of those such measures, namely conservative groups within the party politique, and this ultimately led to his resignation. Between 1894 and 1900, you have the Prince of Hohenlohe, who I'm not going to pronounce his full name because it is particularly convoluted, let's just say. But this individual was an elderly statesman who had very little enthusiasm for major political reforms. And so this created something of a stable and suitable choice for Wilhelm II, who preferred to have a much more hands-on approach, as I've just mentioned, to managerial politics. And so this chancellorship marked a period of relative inaction, allowing Wilhelm to influence and to grow his influence unchecked. So this was one of the longest stints of politics that we see of chancellors under Wilhelm II. The final two are also very, very interesting. Between 1900 and 1909, you have Bernhard von Bülow, who was attempting to balance the aggressive foreign policy ambitions that were instigated by Wilhelm II with more diplomatic prudence. He supported, for example, the policy of Weltpolitik, the idea of a world politics for German Empire, and expanded the German Navy, which would, of course, further antagonize and escalate tensions with Great Britain. Great Britain, who prided herself on her navy and the size of her navy. Domestically, then, Bülow managed to be able to keep the Reichstag in control very carefully, but struggled with a number of social and political divisions that we'll get to in a few minutes' time when we continue to look at the politics of the Reichstag. And this would be the case as opposition to Wilhelm's rule would continue to increase. And then finally, we have Theobald von Hollweg, who was in power and was chancellor between 1909 and 1917. A more cautious approach was pursued under Hollweg, and this was one that sought to compromise with the Reichstag. However, he implemented a number of reforms that were definitely modest and definitely did attempt to address social issues. But under his leadership, the empire moved closer to war, continuing with the growing tensions that Wilhelm continued to emphasize on military power. And so Hollweg's inability to control the Kaiser's ambitions ultimately led to his resignations amid the pressures of World War I, which were obviously taking place under this particular period of time. So as you can see here, a period of relative stability under Otto von Bismarck between the sort of 1871 to 1890 period would be shattered by a series of different chancellors, in fact 5 different chancellors, between 1888 and 1917 under Wilhelm II. And with all of this in mind then, what was the place and the position of the Reichstag during this reign? Well, unlike the period under Wilhelm I, where the Reichstag was relatively neutered, under Wilhelm II, the Reichstag played an increasingly significant role through its powers, although, of course, you have to remember that the limitations of their powers was very much enshrined in the German Constitution of 1871. As political opposition grew, the Reichstag became a platform for criticism of the Kaiser's policies, as well as calls for democratic reform. So even though we know that the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage and served as a representative body, it still nevertheless lacked the executive power necessary. The Chancellor was responsible only to the Emperor, not to the Reichstag, and so the Reichstag had no ability to check the authority of either the Chancellor or the Emperor. The Reichstag did control the budget, which gave it some leverage, especially when it came to things like military spending. And in terms of growing political opposition, the Reichstag became, under Wilhelm II, a venue for increased political opposition as social issues and the Kaiser's authoritarian style began to alienate many citizens. Most notably during this time, the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, would begin to gain widespread support, as did other parties that were critical of the government's conservative policies. In response to this, the Kaiser was very unwilling to engage with the Reichstag in any meaningful way, which further exacerbated tensions between autocracy and the democratic aspirations of the legislature. And this brings us to this question of there being a struggle, of there being a balance that is had between autocracy and democracy during this period. So under Wilhelm II, the struggle between these forces intensified. Wilhelm had a much more hands-on style, and his focus on personal rule created ongoing conflicts with political forces that were pushing for a more representative and democratic style of government. Even though Bismarck was particularly autocratic under Wilhelm I, he still managed to understand the political situation and the political landscape well, such that he could balance autocracy and democracy in a way that was particularly studious of a statesman. This is unlike that of Wilhelm II and his many chancellors. So in terms of autocratic elements, Wilhelm II maintained a firm control over the government, over the military, and over the foreign policy, frequently deciding to bypass the Reichstag and expecting almost complete and unified loyalty from his chancellors. His vision for Germany as a world power, the policy of Weltpolitik, and his focus on military expansion were pursued with very little consultation with the Reichstag itself, and this obviously led to criticism from both liberal and from also socialist factions. With there being such autocratic politics was the need and the desire for democratic aspirations. So the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, as well as other parties that aligned politically with this particular movement, sought greater democratic representation and greater democratic accountability. Despite anti-socialist sentiments, the SDP continued to thoroughly gain support from working class backgrounds and became the largest party in the Reichstag by the end of the 19th century and by the beginning of the 20th century. The growing size and aspirations of the SDP would ultimately clash with Wilhelm's reluctance to accommodate these democratic demands. And so this division would ultimately just further fuel more and more support for the SDP and make Wilhelm II further and further unpopular, more and more unpopular. One such example of this being illustrated, the Kaiser's disregard for civil rights, is in the 1913 Zeebrugge affair. This was an incident in the Alsatian town of Zeebrugge, and it highlighted the Kaiser's disregard for civil rights and the Reichstag's authority. Essentially, following complaints of military abuses, the Reichstag demanded that there be accountability, and Wilhelm refused to hold the military accountable in any meaningful sense. The affair itself then exemplified the rift between the autocratic government and those pushing for democratic oversight and calling for reform more and more and more. So this is what the Zeebrugge affair essentially illustrated and why it is so important to our understanding of just the general political structure and the general political outlook of each of these different parties and the balance and the struggle that exists between autocracy and democracy. So in terms of political development, I just want to spend a teeny bit of time thinking about this before we finish. The SDP, of course, became the primary voice for the working class and continued to advocate for democratic reform, for workers' rights, and for social justice. In terms of the centre party, the Zentrum that we focused on in the previous lesson, they, of course, nevertheless continued to represent Catholic interests and would also be a significant force in the Reichstag, and would also oppose Wilhelm II's disregard for parliamentary authority, which they thought would be able to protect religious and local rights. Other parties, including the National Liberals and Progressives, were representative of the middle class interests and also supported democratic reforms and would also seek to try and curtail the power of the monarchy, again, also clashing with the emperor. It was only really the German Conservative Party and the Free Conservative Party that represented the interests of the landed aristocracy, the military elites, and the monarchists. And so, even though they were part of the Reichstag and part of this sort of seat of democratic accountability, they nevertheless were loyal to the emperor and resisted democratic reforms. But of course, as calls for democratic representation continued to grow, their influence would begin to wane further and further. And then finally, you have the nationalist groups, such as the Pan-German League and other groups which advocated for aggressive foreign policy, colonial expansion, and militarization. And although they shared the imperial ambitions of sort of Weltpolitik under that of Wilhelm, these groups would sometimes criticize the policies as being inconsistent or insufficiently aggressive. So they didn't essentially. So the Pan-German League, for example, didn't oppose Wilhelm II because Wilhelm was too autocratic and not aggressive enough in terms of his foreign, or too aggressive, should I say, in terms of foreign policy. They criticised him for not being aggressive enough. So you can clearly see that you have a critique, but from a completely different side of the spectrum. Now, the next lesson is going to think about economic developments during Imperial Germany, thinking about old and new industries as well as trade and wealth, before we start thinking about some of the social aspects associated with this period of time, the class hierarchy, elitism, and the culture of militarism. And then we will continue thinking about other aspects of this period of German history.